This is TWiT.
True HDR arrives on the desktop. Now, I've looked at some Dell monitors that have VESA 400 certification. VESA 1000 certification seems to be the goal for a lot of people for declaring HDR on the desktop. I won't even get into the miasma of pain and suffering that HDR supports in gaming, and content seems to be on the desktop. What outside of this having an even more marvelous and strange base than your average Alienware monitor, or at least, if nothing else, a more compact base than an Alienware monitor, what makes you think that true HDR has finally arrived on the desktop?
Well, first of all, we do hit that Display HDR 1000 certification on this display. Ooh. Right, so that to me is interesting because we've now looked at Display HDR 400. We've had some Display HDR 600 monitors here, but we also we've had the LG OLED screens here, the Samsung screens here that do HDR, the TVs, I should say, and the difference in kind of just the immediate wow factor of looking at it and knowing something is different on the TVs was there, whereas on the monitors we had seen up until this one were that factor was missing, right? It had better color, larger color space. It was a better monitor than in terms of color reproduction than most other monitors we had seen. This first wave of HDR, but I didn't walk away from it impressed, right? And kind of going, wow, that looks a lot better than what we were used to. And we'll get into the $2,000 price tag that this monitor has, but as soon as you see a game running in HDR, you see video running in HDR on this monitor, you get that wow factor, and it's because of that 1000 nits. Peak brightness and the sustained 600 nits brightness that is part of that Display HDR 1000 spec, and it just stands out. And it's one of those things we've talked about, 3D and variable refresh and all these display technologies that you cannot show people unless they see it in person. I can't show you an image or a video or a clip or an animated GIF to make HDR look like it's going to look. And in fact, we found out like taking HDR screenshots of a game is actually really complicated because even NVIDIA's GeForce Experience keeps them in the HDR color space. When you view them on a standard def monitor, they just look washed out, right? So the pictures you see in our article there are actually taken with a phone, looking at the screen itself, which is probably the best thing we can, best analogy we could come to. In terms of the hardware itself, I will say, again, for a $2,000 monitor, the build quality just seems okay. It doesn't look like a $2,000 monitor. It looks very much like the rest of the ROG line. Ken even commented he thinks it looks less interesting than some of the other ROG line of displays. It's got a thicker bezel. It's a little bit wider, thicker of a device. And you're looking at pictures there now where Ken dissected it and found the control board for it. And what you see there is a rather beefy heatsink and fan combination that is cooling an Altera Fpga and 3 GB of memory on that G-Sync HDR module. If you go on the next picture, you can see the one more down, the Fpga in its entirety. Yeah, there it is. It's not a small chip. It's an expensive part. There's some debate on how expensive. If you look up that specific Altera Fpga on, like a retail establishment like Mauser or something like that, it's like $2,500 or something like that. Clearly NVIDIA is not paying that, but it's 3 gigs of DDR4 memory on there as well, up from the 768 megabytes of memory that the original G-Sync modules use. So there's a lot of cost in there. We kind of initially were estimating it somewhere around $500, maybe. That's just kind of a guess. The more I'm hearing, it's maybe a little bit less than that, maybe closer to $300 for that module.
That's still that's a lot of money.
That's a lot. That's a lot for a processing chip on a display. It does have RGB LED ROG logo on the back. It's a lot of acronyms I just said, but it does have them. It's got something where it will project the ROG logo on the desk in front of you or on the wall behind you. You know, if that's something you're interested in doing. The OSD is really nice. It navigates quickly. It's easy to find what you're looking for. There were some reports. There was like a video going around on YouTube of the Acer G-Sync HDR monitor that is using a similar panel to this, where they were talking about the fan in it being very loud.
Right.
That was because they had VESA mounted it, and the way Acer designed the chassis is that when you VESA mounted that monitor, it kind of blocked the air intake for the monitor, which is not something people have normally had to think about. So it's
right.
You know, you can kind of understand why somebody would miss that. The ASUS one here has offsets or standoffs rather, so that there remains space behind that. You know, the fan, if you put your ear on the other side of the monitor and listened for it, you could hear the fan, but it was not loud. It was not something that I would consider, you know, obnoxious or anything like that. Yeah, you can see the fan kind of through the casing right there. So it is kind of odd to have an actively cooled monitor, but there you go.
Stranger things will have happened.
Yeah, gaming impressions were awesome. I don't want to spend too much time on this. We played Destiny 2, we played Far Cry 5, we played Assassin's Creed Origin, we played Hitman. All these games have HDR support of some kind. There's still a pretty wide variance of what the settings are for each of these. You know, Far Cry 5, I think it was, for example, that had a really good, you could set the minimum paperwhite and then the maximum brightness of the display, right? And you set those two those 2 points, and then it did all the mapping in between. I think Destiny 2 just basically had like an on-off option. Assassin's Creed Origin had an on and a minimum, right? Like trying to set the minimum paperwhite or something like that. So, and not all games support HDR, and some games support it better than others. So there's still some variance there, but it's way better than I expected it to be at this point in terms of, you know, we're playing the alpha Battlefield 5 came out. HDR works on that. It looks fantastic. It's great. And this is a 384 zone dimming, like 384 dimmable zones, I guess. So you get a lot of granularity to the HDR effect. It just looks great, and much better than I would say than any other HDR gaming monitor, any HDR monitor we've actually had in here yet. Plus, it's still G-Sync, right? I haven't even mentioned that part. It's still a variable refresh monitor using this 4K up to 144 hertz, but there's some, you can only run at 98 hertz if you want 10-bit color. If you're willing to go down to 8-bit color, you can head 144 and it's overclocked state. So there's some data rate issues there for DisplayPort. I will say at 4K, the chances of you going over 98 frames per second is pretty low, right? So being able to run in G-Sync mode up to 98 hertz, I still think is really, really good for 4K, especially when you get the HDR in there and everything. So I came away really impressed with it. And you know, the things I would change would be, it's a 27-inch 4K monitor. I'd rather it be like a 32-inch monitor just because of that resolution. And then also that price. The price of $2,000 is kind of a lot to swallow.
It's not inexpensive to hit that VESA 1000 certification. The brightness alone requires a fair amount of it's just, there's a lot of money that goes into getting a screen that bright, especially if color consistency is an issue for you. You know, to put that in perspective, Dell's Ultra Sharp 27, which is their VESA 1000 rated, I want to say, or the equivalent of it. I don't know if they did VESA ratings, but essentially it has most of the specs, I think. You know, is not including any of the gaming features. So there's no G-Sync on that. It's a 60 hertz monitor, but you know, the MSRP is you know, $1,999.99, and it sells for $1,550. You know, I also want to say is, you know, we may kind of poo-poo on the Display HDR 400 spec, but when I was looking at the Dell's 27-inch ultra-thin monitor, the S2718D back in April, one, the color was really fantastic. Two, it actually, despite having a lower certification than you would expect, you're talking about a desktop monitor that has a wider color gamut than almost the vast majority of 4K HDR TVs that were sold in the living room in 2017, and probably comparable and in some cases better brightness numbers than a lot of living room TVs. And the monitor is sitting a couple feet in front of you, not 12 feet or 8 feet away from you. So the upside is, even with the lower VESA certifications, is you're probably looking at brighter lighting. You're just not getting the full contrast. And the advantage to OLED is it doesn't have to hit the same number of nits for a full HDR. For sort of to deliver the same HDR experience, you kind of need a brighter LED or an LCD, or you need an OLED where it goes, the blacks are more true or darker. There's a higher, it's more about the contrast than the actual nit level. But it's if you've been waiting to buy a monitor, I feel like this next year is going to be looking really good, and I think next year is going to be even better. I'm also really curious, tweet at Patrick Norton or at Ryan Shrout if you're thinking about buying a new monitor, because one of the things we see, I think our audience probably buys bigger monitors earlier than the average person, but it always amazes me to realize what a tiny percentage of consumers on Steam, it's like single digits for monitors bigger than 1080p, and the next largest monitor size after 1080p a gaming monitor, just regular 1080p monitors on Steam, is actually a lower resolution, kind of a Mach 720p panel size that we saw for a long time before 1080p became affordable. I'm kind of curious. I also will say, if you've been using your monitor for 5 years or more, putting it next to a brand new monitor will suddenly have you believing in the sort of, decay rate on the backlighting.
Yeah, that's really likely. My kind of final takeaway on this monitor is really, it's clearly the best gaming monitor that you can buy, but it's really hard to recommend at $2,000. You have to know your budget and know that you can afford it. This is the kind of person, if you don't have a 1080 Ti or a Titan XP, this is not the right monitor for you. Just both because of the price range and because of the resolution and refresh rates that you're going to be wanting to hit with it. So, I wouldn't buy this and say, oh, buy this and now you're future-proofed, ready for HDR. There's going to be improvements. There's going to be, price reductions as the months and quarters go by.
There's going to be more competition.
Unless you plan on utilizing it now. Yeah, there will be.
The reason VESA put a spec together is because they expect a lot of competition in this area. And also understand that in many cases, you may not be able to get the settings you want to deliver the frame rates you want without spending more on GPUs than you want to spend. Yeah.